All right, today in class, we are going to be looking at some techniques. And one of the things we are going to be really paying attention to is our water. Because like I just did this swatch, I bought a meet-in set. It's more of a student grade, and I wanted to swatch it out and see how it looks. But we know that when we have really intense pigment all the way down to very watery pigment, we get different results. But today we want to play with how we can use water in our techniques of painting and how different, different techniques are going to give us different results. So I also just bought some new brushes, so I'm gonna use those with this. This is a Paul Cezanne. It's a synthetic squirrel brush. I bought it online. And when you buy new brushes, you want to make sure and just rinse them off really well, because there is like a sizing or something that comes on brushes. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just do a really basic wet on wet technique. If when you're doing this, you want to kind of tape off squares, you can do that. It'll give you a neater look, but I don't find the need to do all that. I'm just going to, show you these techniques, and this is a great way to just practice too. So what I'm doing here is I'm just wetting the paper, and I want my paper to be saturated with paper. We touch it with our hands. Obviously, I've been painting. It looks like I've been working on a car, but I've been painting using a technique that's got me really grubby right now. So, excuse my fingernails, but excuse me. I want to make sure that my paper is nice and saturated, so it should be shiny, right? This square is shiny. Hopefully you can see that, but there's not water puddling anywhere. So I'm just going to go in, and it doesn't matter what color you're using for this, but this is one of my favorite sky techniques, and that's a gradient wash. And this is a wet and wet technique. I've got wet paint here, right? So I can wet my paint a little bit. It's wet, but I want to start out with it at kind of a thicker wash here. So I'm gonna start up top, and this wet and wet technique is called a gradient wash. So I'm gonna start intense there, and then I'm gonna add more water to my brush, and then I'm gonna start to slowly bring this down. And you can rinse your brush and add more water, and you're going back and forth, and you're kind of wanting to make sure that you're keeping this little puddle going with you. And if you come to a spot where, you need to, you can always dry off your brush to get very light. So this is a gradient wash, right? So it goes from dark to light. We use this a lot of times in our skies. Okay, so that's our first wet and wet technique. The next thing that we want to look at, let me actually, so I know that we talked about it on class 2, but my water system is that 3-part water system. I have fresh water, I have my using cup, and then I have my dump bucket. All right. Now I'm making another wet square here. So when you touch your paper, you leave behind little, fingerprints from the oil on your hands. It just happens. And we can't really prevent that necessarily. So when I'm wetting my paper, I do kind of just scrub it a little bit, and that helps to make it so you're not going to have a spot where there's oil on your paper, and then you can't, the paint doesn't stick. All right, so I'm going to use this ultramarine again, but I'm also going to use some of this rose. So this definitely has a different consistency than the paints that I normally use, so it's kind of interesting. Okay, so I'm going to come in just the same with my ultramarine on top here. I'm going to start just bringing that down. But then I'm going to add my rose here. So we can have some blending that's going to happen with the wet on wet. And I can even, so you can make this wash in lots of different ways, right? Depending on what you want to do. So I'm actually just even blending some of that color in this bottom section. So you can transition colors this way. The one thing that I want to remind everybody of when you are transitioning colors in some sort of gradient wash like this, you need to make sure that the color that these two colors will make is one that you want. For example, blue skies and yellow sunshine makes a weird green sky, right? So let's kind of look at how to deal with that, because that is something that we're going to want to use in our actual class project. Okay, so I'm just making a nice little wet spot here. Yes, there's a little pink on my brush. We're not going to worry about it. It's not going to make that big of a difference in the end result. So I have this here, and let's say, again, I'm going to use my French ultramarine for my blue, and maybe I'm making a little sky, and I'm coming down here, but I want to have a sunny horizon, and so I want to use maybe some of my yellow for that. Now, if I add this yellow directly to this blue like this, I'm going to get a green, right? And it's going to blend on the page, and it's going to give me these green things. And that's not necessarily what I want in this sky. So I can take this yellow and I leave a strip where the blue is not touching the yellow. And so we have some white, and then we can come up and bring the yellow around, right? And let's say we were making some water, then we could do the same thing here and leave that strip before bringing in our blue. So when you're doing wet on wet and you're creating a mix that you don't want to blend like this, where we're getting green, you need to leave that white space in between so that your paint has enough room to move around, because it will move more as it dries. Okay, so last wet on wet, this paper is actually a little bit damaged right here, but I'm not going to worry about it. So last wet on wet that we're going to try on this row, we're actually just going to paint a circle. And I'm doing this because I want to show you how much paint will, and this is, you know, here we go. Here's a nice concentrated pile of paint. And I'm making one circle, and we're just gonna let it be and see how far that paint will spread out with this water. Okay, let's try some more wet and wet techniques. I'm gonna go ahead and paint this square right here just with water. And then I'm gonna leave it alone while I work on these other techniques. I'm just gonna leave this square alone here for now. So, up in this part, I'm gonna paint a square for this wet little area. I am going to pick a color. I am going to use this purple on this. And I'm just gonna do basically a flat wash. I want this to pretty much all be the same-ish tone. Where here I have a gradient, here I have variegated. See how nicely that has blended and didn't make green lines, right? So this is just a flat wash, like this. And we're going to leave that alone for a minute now as well. Okay, on to this next square. Wetting this down. When you're wetting, make sure that you don't have big puddles unless that's what you're going for. You want a kind of a uniform wetness, shiny, but not puddling. Okay. I'm gonna go back in and do some more of that purple. Do a little bit of a more intense pigment on this one. Not quite that intense maybe, but a pretty intense pigment because I want this to really kind of show up. Now on this section, I am going to use a little piece of bubble wrap and literally stamp it, but it stuck to my finger when I put that down. So you stamp it, you kind of press it in a little bit, and then you leave it alone. Okay, so let's move on to this square. Just getting a nice wet, shiny surface without puddles. You can always dry off your brush a little bit, but most of the time, if you just kind of go over it, if you haven't totally, you know, dumped loads of water on it, this will be good just to rub your brush back and forth. Just because I want to give this impression, I am going to use my ultramarine. But honestly, these are exercises that the colors don't matter. This is not a color exercise. This is a technique exercise. So your colors don't matter at all. Okay, so I've just got a flat wash similar to this. And now I'm using just plastic wrap. I've used this too with recycled things like plastic bags from the grocery store, you know? So we're pressing this down just like we did over here, and we're gonna leave it alone. Now this square is damp. It's no longer wet, but it's damp. So I am going to take some of my rose, just like I did up here, and I'm gonna paint a circle. Paper is damp, but we can see already the differences that we have. Now we might see a little bit of spread, but we're not gonna get that, right? So to end this row, all I'm gonna do is come back and drop some clean water in here. Paper is damp, not all the way dry, but damp. So I'm gonna put this water just on here in drops, and then in a little bit, we'll come back and see the result of that. Okay. So let's continue with our wet and wet kind of a thing. So here, let me change up my water real quick. Just painting another wet square. here. And since I have this purple out, I quite like it. I'm going to do this, maybe a little bit more intensity here, just so that we can really see the results. And I don't mind keeping it a little bit variegated or not perfectly flat. It doesn't really matter. So what I have here is kosher salt. It's just from my kitchen. And then you drop this on and you leave it alone. Now, you can use any size salt crystals. Kosher salt's just what I happen to use in my kitchen, but iodized salt is finer and it works the same way. It'll just give you finer marks from the salt. I've used like really chunky like Himalayan sea salt before, and that's really interesting and is great for things like rocks. All right, let's do this next one. I find this very interesting, and I've been experimenting with using alcohol in different ways with my paints, and even introducing some alcohol inks into my paints. So just kind of toggling back and forth. I'm gonna do a little bit of this French ultramarine. Again, just a pretty basic flat wash here. And then I have just isopropyl alcohol, and you can absolutely use a pipette or anything else like that to drop it onto the paper. I don't see mine right now, so I'm just going to use my brush. And when you drop the alcohol on the paper, it ends up being really cool results. I find this really useful for things like bubbles and things like that. So I really love that technique. And let's do something else that's even simpler with a wet on wet, and that is taking two colors, right? So the thinner paint should really go on the bottom, right? When you're mixing two things in watercolor, especially if your paper is wet, you need to have your thinner on the bottom and then your thicker on top. So I'm going to take some orange, it's a yellow orange, and have it pretty concentrated, not super thin, not super thick, but thicker than the rose was. And I am going to just drop it in, right? So this is a really neat way to get some color mixing on your paper, as well as get the blooms and spreads that are so common with watercolor, and make that beautiful kind of atmospheric thing. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to do on this page is in this completely dry spot with a very dry brush. I am just wiping my brush off on my paper towel. I'm going to pick up straight pigment. Now these are new, so you need to make sure that your paints are activated, but this is dry paint on dry paper. Okay, and I'm just trying to make that same circle. And, you know, it's very interesting. Hopefully you can see that with that. How as your brush dries out, you're getting the texture of the paper. And so you're getting different result. So this is the same color 3 different ways on very wet paper. On damp paper, you can see it spread just a tiny little bit, but it has a lot of sharp edges. And then the dry brush, where you are getting the opportunity to see, you know, the texture of the paper itself. So 3 different ways to use the same color. Okay. So I am going to just take some of this water up. It's not really soaking in that much, but hopefully we get enough to come back and see those results. So we are going to come back to this in a little bit and look at our results after everything has dried. Okay, so our paper is dry, so let's take a look at our results. It's mostly dry. This one didn't get the result that I was quite looking for there. I may have been a little bit too dry when I dropped the water in, but we can, you know, just know that this could happen. So here we have our gradient wash. These are wet and wet techniques. So we have the gradient. We have the variegated wash. We have a variegated wash with separation, right? We talked about how we didn't want the yellow and blue to mix, so we left a white line in between because we saw when the yellow and blue mix, we get this green. And then this is wet and wet drop, or we painted a circle, but we're basically putting the pigment on and letting it run. In this one, what I wanted to show you, and it's really hard to see, there's some that's still a little bit wet, but here we're gonna get blooms and cauliflower when we've got damp paper and we drop in wet, whether that's wet paint or whether it's just water. So this is the cauliflower, because that creates kind of like this line around where the water went, right? Like a watermark. So this, we have our bubble wrap. And we just put that on, and it has dried and left these cool, interesting dots. Then we have our plastic wrap. And I love using this technique for water because you get these really interesting wave shapes that are just magical, and it takes so little effort. And then you have wet on damp. And again, this is probably a little bit drier than I intended. The point is, here you're gonna get a big flow of pigment out into the water. Here you're gonna get less. We still have some, you know, spread here, but mostly we're getting a hard edge. Now, with salt, you just rub it off with your finger. And then you have these really interesting shapes. Again, there are different reasons to use something like this. It's beautiful to create almost a snow or rain technique with kosher salt or iodized salt. It's also helpful in rocky areas. And then this is the alcohol. And we drop this into the damp paint, and we get these really cool bubble effects. And then this is wet and wet, and this is dropping pigment. So here we can see we're getting this color mix here, but we're seeing our little flowers emerge from our watercolor here, right? And then this is dry brush on dry paper, right? And then we're seeing again this texture of the paper, really intense pigment. So different looks completely. So these are just some of the techniques that we can use in our painting, but between this and, you know, our brush strokes, our exercise with all of our different brush strokes, you're able to see that with one brush and just this kind of basic knowledge, there's a lot that we can paint.